This is at daily newspapers, including the New York Times and the Dallas Morning News. She's also been a writer at large and remains a contributing editor for Texas Monthly Magazine. As the editor of the Glen Rose Reporter, she won the Nancy Monson Freedom of Information Award, which is given out from the Texas Press Association and the Freedom of Information Foundation of Texas. This is for stories and columns promoting open government, as well as she's also won first place awards and was named Journalist of the Year by the West Texas Press Association for 2 years in a row. After leaving the Reporter in August, she began teaching media writing in English for here. There's my free speech, right? For us at Tarleton State, we're very happy to have her. She's recently launched an online publication called the Glen Rose Current, and you can follow it in Facebook as well. And she's offering her services, continuing her quest for public service, journalism, and promotion of open government. If you will help me, please join Kathryn Jones.
Well, thanks so much for coming, and thanks to the student chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists and the Department of Communication Studies for having this event, especially Dr. Charles Howard, Dr. Maven, and Assistant Professor Dan Malone for organizing this event. It's really, I think it's important to gather together and talk about the First Amendment and to use it. If you've traveled to other countries, even just as close as our neighbor to the south, you see what happens when the media doesn't have our freedoms or is intimidated by the government or even criminals to report the truth. And I want to start by telling you about an experience Dan and I had some years ago in Glen Rose. We were approached by a publisher who was looking for people to run a new newspaper he was starting in Glen Rose, and he had a lot of money, and he had an ulterior motive in starting this publication. It's not this one, but it was called the Glen Rose Newspaper. Great name there. He had some land he wanted to develop, and he basically wanted the paper to editorialize about it. And so that was suspect to begin with, but then he said something that really grabbed our attention, and not in a good way. He told us he wanted the paper to focus on happy news. And we thought, good luck with that. Now, news doesn't always have to be negative, of course. I've written my share of positive news, if you want to characterize it that way. And to me, news is news. I don't characterize it as positive or negative. So when people in the community receive recognition, when their kids do something great, when people celebrate anniversaries, when they get married, you know, that kind of happy news. Of course, maybe that's not always happy news. Sometimes you may read a wedding announcement and think, oh, you know, poor girl or poor guy. But it's nice to read happy news. But we thought to purposely avoid the bad news, if you want to characterize it as bad or negative news, is not living up to the First Amendment, and it's self-censorship. The goal would not be, as the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics says, to seek truth and report it. So what this paper was going to do to us was not seeking truth at all. It was covering up the truth. Because the truth is the good, the bad, and the sometimes ugly. And if you remember the name of that, if you remember that Clint Eastwood movie, now you can do the little doo-doo-doo in your head there. The good, the bad, and sometimes ugly. And sometimes it is very, very ugly. So Dan and I didn't take that job, not surprisingly. The guy did launch the paper over in Glen Rose, and at times it's really laughable. When a man tried to abduct a woman at gunpoint in the parking lot of the Brookshire's grocery store, and she fought him off, she was fine, that newspaper didn't report a word of it. It was as if it did not happen. Of course, we had on our front page, I was filing open records requests to get information about this guy's background. So let me ask you this. Are readers better off or worse off knowing about this incident? You know, to me, knowing about it reminds people that, you know, we can't take our safety for granted even in a small town. We've got to watch our back. Sometimes we can't get too complacent about crime, even in a very small town. But if you read our competitor, you wouldn't have even known this happened. but lots of people don't want to know about bad things. The often misquoted line from a poem by one of my favorite poets, Thomas Gray, and you English professors here, I'm sure, would agree with me, this is often misquoted. You often hear ignorance is bliss. Well, that's not what the line really says. The line from the poem actually says, where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. So in other words, it's better not to know something. You'll be a lot happier if you don't know the truth. And I don't agree with that. You may be happier, but are you better off? I've always thought knowledge was power, information was power, and but not everyone sees it that way, of course. It's really funny because, as Sarah said, I work for the New York Times, I work for Texas Monthly, Dallas Morning News, lots of big publications. And you have a certain kind of anonymity, even though you're writing for large audiences, you have a certain anonymity. But it wasn't until I worked in Glen Rose as the editor of the Glen Rose Reporter that I really came to appreciate the meaning of the term "don't shoot the messenger." Because people would come up to me in the grocery store and say, "Are you that newspaper lady?" And I didn't know if they were going to shake my hand or they were going to shoot me. And most of the time they said, "I want to shake your hand," but I didn't always know because a lot of people would rather exist in that netherworld of not knowing. So I haven't been shot yet, knock on wood. But there were happy times when I was concerned that the ammo might be real, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But when I took the helm of the Glen Rose Reporter in February of 2010, I became editor of a publication that had been pretty dull. Under the previous owner, it typically had 3 things on the cover every single week. One was a fire, a house fire, a trailer house that caught on fire. The other was a car wreck of the week. And the other was, and I'm not making this up, the 40-year rainfall total. There was a chart on the front page of the paper every week that showed the rainfall totals for the last 40 years. No explanation, just the chart. And then the editor typically got the minutes from the city council meeting and the county commissioners meeting and the school board meeting, and he sat in his office and he wrote them. He never actually went to the meetings. In fact, he was never visible in town at all. So even the local Boy Scout troop couldn't get its events published in the paper, and when anyone complained, he would typically say, "If you don't like it, you buy it, then you can put what you want to in it." So finally somebody did buy it, a parent company that now also owns the Stephenville Empire Tribune, and they hired me. And what I found when I became editor was a community absolutely starving for news, for real news, not happy news, real news. And I started giving it to them, and not surprisingly, there were a lot of people that didn't like this, especially the folks who were serving on the Glen Rose City Council at the time. And I'll never forget the first city council meeting I covered. I was sitting in the front row, and the mayor was sitting up in her chair, and she was talking to these people on the front row. Like there was nobody else in the room. Nobody was going up to the lectern and identifying themselves. And one of them was her husband, who was on the preservation board, and her son, who was the head of the tax board. And they were just all talking amongst themselves about what to do with this, how to do the city's business. And I remember I sat there and I watched this, and I thought, well, this is really weird, and I've never seen anything like this before. And it just kind of went downhill from there. So I started writing about conflicts of interest in City Hall, and there were a lot of them, and I'll put up a couple of these columns here. I should also say right off the bat that large newspapers always separate the editorial page, the opinion page, from the news page. But the Glen Rose Reporter, I was the only one, and people were afraid to speak out when I would try to interview them for stories. Well, I don't want to cause any trouble. You can't use my name. So it became up to me to speak out about stuff. So I became the columnist and the reporter, and ideally there was that separation there. But again, I felt like I really didn't have any choice because there were things going on behind the scenes that I really wanted to write about. So I started writing about these conflicts of interest at City Hall, and you can imagine how this went over. with these folks who were in power and had their little family dynasty. The mayor even went so far as to try to yank the city's public notice advertising from the paper. And she said, "Oh, the paper, it's just so negative. No, it's just so negative. And I don't think we should be spending our money with something that's just so negative all the time." So she tried to get our public notices, which didn't amount to a lot of money, but it was a symbolic thing. She tried to get those revoked, and I stood up and gave my spiel, and the council barely voted to stay with the public notice, publishing the public notices in the report. So then she called my boss. She said I had a vendetta against her, and her daughter alerted my boss, who came flying over from Steenville to confront me. And I told her, "Gee, I thought this was what journalists were supposed to do, try to keep people in power accountable." And she didn't really agree with that. So I kept doing what I was doing, and you know what? Well, heck, this is Free Speech Week. I'll just say the shit hit the fan when I discovered that the son of the mayor pro tem and the stepson of the police chief had lied on his city job application. And what happened was, a source in law enforcement tipped me off and said, "Hey, you might want to check into the background of somebody who works for the city." And he didn't tell me who, and it didn't take me long to figure it out because I'd already written about this guy, because he and some of his buddies who worked for the city went to Fort Worth to buy supplies for the local city park and pool, and they decided to go to lunch at Hooters. And they decided to drink a lot of beer and have some appetizers and live it up, and then charge the city to it. So charge the city for it. So the taxpayers ended up doing this. So I found out about it, called an open records request, and wrote a column about how this guy and his friends, some of whom were his relatives, had gone to Hooters and had run up a tab at Hooters and at some other restaurants actually that the taxpayers were paying for. So. But hey, I'm sure they went there just for the great wings. So I followed the public records trail, and I found that this guy, whose name happened to be Moose, had been arrested numerous times for writing hot checks and some other things. He was actually convicted for one of the hot check offenses, and he received deferred adjudication, which was basically a slap on the wrist after he promised never to do it again and put him on probation. But the worst thing occurred here in Stephenville, where he worked as an apartment maintenance man, and he was arrested in 2005 for repeatedly masturbating in front of several young girls, Tarleton students, who were terrified of him. He would be standing naked in his doorway as they walked by to get to their apartment, and he'd be doing his thing, or on the balcony overlooking the pool when they were out there with their boyfriends. And they were all appalled, and and he was arrested. He received deferred adjudication, and Mommy and Daddy got him a job in Glenrose as, guess what? The guy working at the local pool. So, and that's why the people in law enforcement tipped me off, because they were concerned. So whether to run the story or not really wasn't the issue. We were going to run it, and I knew there was going to be a storm. And this was the story that we ran. I wanted to talk to him, talk to the city attorney to set up an interview. He didn't go, but he sent his mother and another city councilman, and would not speak to me about it. So I had gone to Fort Worth, I had gone to the courthouse in Decatur, for Wise County, and got the records from here in Stephenville. So I had all these records. And I also had a copy of his job application that showed clearly that the question was clearly asked on his job application, "Have you ever been convicted of a crime?" And he had checked no. So interestingly, that application wasn't kept at City Hall. It was kept at the maintenance barn, where it could be kept hidden, apparently. So we ran this front page story with his mugshot, and then the fallout began. His mother, the mayor pro tem, said I had ruined his life. A reporter from Fort Worth Weekly came down to write a story about all the mayhem, and This is what I had up earlier. I really love the cover. I have to say. But let's see what other one. And I wrote a story about it, and I interviewed her, and she said that I was an evil bitch, and that the biggest compliment I've ever received. And I really got crucified in the community. We had people calling up, canceling subscriptions. We had advertisers canceling their ads. We had people saying really all sorts of terrible things, and which was fine. It's certainly their privilege to do so. Even the people who supported me with the story still called me and said, I really hated to see the word masturbate in the newspaper. And I thought, well, what would you have me say? I mean, I could think of all sorts of things. At least masturbate sounds rather medical, and it's actually the term that the police use. So I tried to explain that to them, but they still, I just hated to see that. So people tried to hurt the paper financially. We got a lot of hate mail. It got to the point where I did not work in the office by myself without locking the door. I did look behind my back. I was cautious. I never got a physical threat, but I certainly felt there were people who had some were thinking some bad voodoo about me. So what happened then was this guy, the city council, some people in the city council thought he needed to be disciplined. They held a closed session, and when they came out, they announced that they decided not to take any discipline against this guy. He did not get a letter of reprimand, nothing in his personnel file, so he basically walked off scot-free. So interestingly, 2 weeks after this happened, I learned that he had not showed up for work. His supervisor went out to his house, suspected that he was drugged up, ordered him to take a drug test, and he refused, and he was fired. And then all of a sudden it was, oh, Kathryn, you did the right thing. He was a bad guy, and so they saw that as a sign that I had actually really done the right thing. So, certainly all these folks have the right to, call me an evil bitch or whatever they want to call me. They certainly have every right to use their financial resources to however they want to. And I will certainly defend their right to call me names, just as I defend our right to print for the newspaper to print so-called bad news. This series, as Sarah pointed out, did win a state award for promoting open government. And then that prompted a lot of people to go on Facebook and say that I didn't deserve to win anything except a big spoon so I could stir the pot of controversy. Ooh. So, actually they called it manure, but So what Dr. Howard said at the end of his talk yesterday, for those of you who were here, really resonated with me, that you can't let those who want to attack the First Amendment or mold it to suit their purposes intimidate you. I joked that I had to grow another spine and thicker skin when I took this job. People will hate you for what you do. They will use gossip, lies, financial pressure. They will call your boss. They will get on Facebook and trash you. They will do whatever they can to try to make you feel uncomfortable and try to silence you, or at least undermine your credibility. And the only thing I knew to do was to ignore it and just to keep doing what I was doing, because most of the people in the community said that that's what they wanted. They wanted the real news. They didn't want it sugar-coated. They didn't want it withheld. They wanted to know what was going on in their community, period. And so I just kept doing that. I know some of you student journalists out there, and some of those student journalists who came before you are grappling with some of these same issues. It's uncomfortable when you have to report on things the university administration might rather not have out in the open. Sometimes it's even scary, and it takes a lot of spine to do it, but you have to do it. and keep in mind the greater good of keeping those in power accountable and promoting transparency, especially when public dollars are being used, whether it's at a university or in government. You have every right to know how safe you are on campus. You have every right to know how your money's being used. And when people try to shut down that conversation, I just think that's wrong. So my bosses at the parent company where I worked that owned the Glen Rose Reporter did not grow that extra spine. And they cowered to community pressure, and this is a very small but very vocal group of people that were calling for my firing and and wanted me gone. So I repeatedly found myself having to defend myself to my own bosses, and I even had my supervisor, the regional director of the Southwest operation, tell me that I didn't need to be, quote, making enemies, and that it was apparent to him that I, quote, loved controversy. He never looked at any other stories I wrote about all the great things in the community, or what the Art League was doing, or what the school district was doing, and all of its accolades. He just was listening to the people who were complaining. And I really could not believe what I was hearing from him. I sure didn't go out of my way to make enemies, but I didn't seek controversy. And I didn't seek out the controversy, but I wasn't afraid of it either. And in all of our discussions, I never heard him mention the First Amendment. I'm not even convinced that he's ever read it. But I did hear him use the word revenues a whole lot. So I ended up leaving the Reporter in August after becoming very disillusioned with corporate journalism and the profit motive. And not many of you may realize this, but I think it's something that you should know, is that your local newspaper and the Glen Rose Reporter and the Waxahachie Daily Light and the Brownwood Bulletin are all owned by a company that is now owned by its creditors. So in Stephenville, in Glen Rose, in Waxahachie, and in Brownwood, the ultimate owner of the paper is the Royal Bank of Canada. Once a year, the paper has to publish a statement of ownership that's usually buried somewhere in the paper. If you go back and look, you will see that the statement of ownership will say that the Royal Bank of Canada owns these newspapers. And so I think it says a lot that community newspapers such as these are now being controlled by foreign interests and bankers to boot. And our local control just went out the window. Our profits did not come back to the newspaper of the community. They went to this corporate pot to pay lawyers and management mercenaries who parachuted in and were trying to make the operations appear as profitable as possible so they could sell the company. And at some point I had to ask myself, why am I doing this? And I was doing it for public service, for sure. It sure wasn't for the money. And I hate to see that my former newspaper now is running on its website videos such as one of a baby eating lemons for the first time to generate hits and page views rather than to cover real news. And I'm afraid that is the world of journalism today at many places. So I've been kicking around how to stay true to First Amendment ideals, and I ended up starting my own venture. The website we initially launched is the Glen Rose Current. Potentially, we hope to have a full-fledged multimedia company to bring public service journalism to small communities. And of course, I got into hot water with the very first story that ran on the website. It concerned a city councilman. Interestingly, it was a city councilman who accompanied the mother of the guy who was under fire in Glen Rose, but he was accused of abusing his power and bullying by a city employee, and it was all over a dead cat. I can't make this stuff up. It's just priceless. What had happened was a cat had got run over in front of his house, and it was flopping around, and he called the sheriff's dispatcher 911. Which actually dispatches calls for city animal control. Now, animal control in Glen Rose is not open on the weekend. It's only open during the week, and it's only for emergencies on the weekend. Well, so he called the dispatcher's office and said, I need to get somebody over here. There's a calico cat flopping around in my street, and I need somebody to come get it. Well, he said, okay, we'll call the person on call and get her over there. So he called back a little bit later and said, oh, the cat died. Did you reach this animal control person? And the sheriff's dispatcher said, well, I'm sorry, they will only come out if it's an emergency. Now, if the cat's dead, they won't come out and remove dead animals on the weekend, you know, because it's overtime. And he said, you don't understand. I'm her boss. I'm on the city council. And he repeated that about a million times. I'm on the city council. I'm on the city council. She will come and get this cat. And the dispatcher said, well, where's the cat now? And he said, well, I moved it. I moved it. It's off the side of the road. And so the sheriff, there were a couple more conversations back and forth. The sheriff finally gets a hold of the animal control person, and he calls her up, and she repeats, you know, I'm sorry, I can't. It's city policy for me to come out and pick up a dead animal on the weekends. It's overtime. And this guy had been a real opponent of city employees getting overtime to begin with. So, but he said, yeah, you will come and get this cat. She said, no, sir, I can't. He said, well, this is not going to look good for you on Monday. And so she called her boss, the city administrator, crying, and she was afraid of her job, losing her job. And she ended up filing a complaint against him. And so I filed, it used to be called the Texas Open Records Act, now it's the Texas Public Information Act. I filed a request to get those records of the phone calls and the recordings and all the documents pertaining to this complaint. So, and I put those on our website. Let's see if I can pull this up without too much trouble here, without too much time. I will try to do that. Are shortening our URL to Glen Rose Current, but for right now, this is what we're doing. Okay. Right now, it kind of looks like a blog, so. Okay. I'm not sure how to get this, how to make this smaller. Anyway, you can go on the website now. You can see the stories. You can also go up to audio, and you can click on the audio, hear the recordings, and you can also click on documents and actually see the documents that were scanned. And again, you're not going to get it all here because this is a small screen. But the documents, so people could go online and they could see the documents for themselves and listen to the recordings for themselves. And everybody who listened to them told me, they said, oh, you know, this was great to hear this because he was clearly abusive to her. Anyway, to make a long story short, once he found out that all this was online and available to people, he called the mayor and said, how can we make this go away? And he apologized to her. The council took no action against him. But, you know, so much time and energy was wasted over a dead cat that, you know, I mean, couldn't he have put on his big boy pants and gotten a shovel and scooped the cat up, and, you know, instead of going through all this? And she felt like he had abused his power, berating you know, an underling, and many on the city council agreed with her. So, so let me end today with a quote from President John F. Kennedy. Whatever your political inclinations may be, I think you would agree his words are very telling today when so much of news is trivial and geared toward entertainment. Kennedy was addressing the American Newspaper Publishers Association in New York City in 1961. And this sums up what I tried to do as editor of the Glen Rose Reporter and what we're now trying to do with the Glen Rose Current. And he said, quote, without debate, without criticism, no administration and no country can succeed, and no republic can survive. That is why the Athenian lawmaker Solon decreed it a crime for any citizen to shrink from controversy. And that is why our press was protected by the First Amendment, the only business in America specially protected by the Constitution, not primarily to amuse and entertain, not to emphasize the trivial and the sentimental, not to simply give the public what it wants, but to inform, to arouse, to reflect, to state our dangers and our opportunities, to indicate our crises and our choices, to lead, mold, educate, and sometimes even anger public opinion. I seem to be really good at that last part, and I don't plan to stop doing it as long as it serves a greater purpose. So when you read news you don't want to hear about, don't shoot the messenger. Save your ammo for the real targets, and that is those in power who try to abuse it, and those who don't want transparency and try to hide it from people. So I appreciate your attention. Thanks again to the SPJ and the Communications Studies Department for putting this on. And I have copies of my remarks, and some of y'all are covering this for class. I have some cards up here, extra credit sign-up sheets for students in my media writing class. And I'd be happy to, I don't know if we have time to answer questions or not.
Yeah.
A couple minutes. I'd be happy to answer any questions anybody has.